Hello students, welcome again. In today's video lecture, we are going to discuss P.B. Shelley as a critique. Shelley, who lived during the period of Romantic Revival, has written this essay, Defense of Poetry, and Shelley has expressed his critical views on poets and poetry in this essay, which is the focus of today's discussion. As I told you, P.B. Shelley, he has been considered as an important poet during the period of Romantic Revival. He has been the most brilliant star in the galaxy of English poetry during this period of New Romanticism. His all critical remarks are found in his letters which he has written to his friends and relatives. Moreover, his critical remarks you find in the prefaces which are written by himself in the beginning of his poems, and also he has written some prose essays. Okay, so Shelley as a critique we find in his letters, number one, in the prefaces that he has written to his poems, and number three, some of his prose essays. But his most important critical essay is Defense of Poetry, which was written in 1821, but it was posthumously published. Posthumously means it was published after his death. Shelley died in 1822, but this essay was published first in 1840. Okay, in this essay, Shelley has tried to reply the charges laid down by Peacock. Now, Peacock was also a poet and an essayist of the Romantic Revival who had attacked the poets and poetry in those times. So Shelley wanted to defend the poets and poetry. As a defense of poetry, this essay has been written by Shelley. Okay. Now, before we discuss what Shelley is discussing in this essay, let me remind you that if you examine the whole history of English literary criticism or literary criticism, forget English literary criticism, then you find several critics and thinkers who attacked poets and poetry. The first attack was done by Plato. Okay, Plato attacked the poets and poetry, which was defended by his own disciple Aristotle. Second attack we find in England during the 16th century Elizabethan age, during the period of Renaissance. There was one thinker, Stephen Goosen. He also attacked the poets and poetry, but at that time there was Sir Philip Sidney who replied the charges laid down by Stephen Goosen. And the third attack we come across is Thomas Love Peacock. Okay, as you can see on the screen, Thomas Love Peacock was himself a poet, a writer, an essayist of the period of Romantic Revival. He also attacked the poets and poetry, and this third attack was defended by P.B. Shelley. Now let's move ahead to discuss what were the arguments of Peacock. Thomas Love Peacock, he published one essay. The title of this essay is 4 Ages of Poetry, and that was published in 1820. In this essay, he has attacked the poets and poetry. Here, he divides the whole development and progress of poetry into 4 important stages. Okay, remember these 4 stages. The first stage is the Iron Stage, second stage is the Golden Age, third one the silver age, and the last one is the brass age. Just like if you see human life can also be divided into stages, right? Childhood, youth, middle age and old age. In the same manner, as far as poetry is concerned, Peacock said that you can divide the whole development of poetry into these four stages. Okay, iron age, golden age, silver age and brass age. According to him, poetry, the origin of poetry, that period is known as the iron age. Okay, and the best, then later on poetry develops, and that is the best period of poetic creations, poetic productions, and that is called the golden age. The third stage is silver age, which produces the artificial kind of poetry. Okay, not natural or spontaneous kind of poetry is produced during the silver age. And during the fourth age, that is the brass age, there you find a decline, a downfall of poetry and poetic productions. And now the charge comes. Peacock says that we are living during the last age, that is the brass age. We are living means Peacock himself is talking about his own times. What was his own times? That was the period of Romantic Revival. To be specific, 1798 to 1830. This was actually the golden period in the history of English poetry. William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, John Keats, these were some of the greatest poets who were writing fantabulous poetry, but Peacock believes that this is the brass age, the last age. It is the age of decline. It is the age of decay, according to him. He compares the poets as barbarians. Barbarians means the ancient people who are not civilized, who even do not wear proper clothes. They even do not have manners. Such people are known as barbarians. So he says that a poet in our times means his times, okay, in the beginning of the 19th century. He says that a poet in our times is a semi-barbarian, uncivilized person in a civilized community. He says that our society is a civilized community, but some of the poets who are living in this society, they are uncivilized, semi-barbarian people. Not only this, Peacock even compares the poets with a crab. Crab you must have seen, He says that the march of the poet's intellect is just like that of a crab backward. The crab, if you see, the crab does not move forward. It moves backward all the time. Poets are the people whose intellect, whose thoughts go backward when they write poetry. So these are the charges. Peacock even compares the poets with the historians and the philosophers, and he says that the historians and the philosophers are advancing in, and they are accelerating the progress of knowledge. Okay, so the knowledge is progressed by philosophers and historians, but the poet is wallowing the rubbish of departed ignorance. Such bad words are used for the poets by Thomas Love Peacock. He says that the poets are ignorant people and raking up the ashes of dead savages, okay, or to find gewgaws and rattles for the grown babies of the age. This is how he says that poets, they live in an olden age, ancient times, uncivilized times, and such uncivilized pictures are presented by the poets in their poetry, which does not advance the world, okay, which does not help us progress in our life, and they go backward. So Peacock links the philosopher and the historian with reason and the poet with superstition, andhashraddha, okay, and backwardness. For him, the historian and the philosopher, they are the civilized people. They produce some civilized projects, but on the other hand, the poets are the barbarians and they indulge in some useless activity. Writing poetry, according to Peacock, is a useless activity. Okay, so at last he concludes that it can never make a philosopher, nor a statesman, nor in any class of life a useful or rational man. He says that poetry can never make you a good philosopher. Poetry can never produce a good statesman. Statesman means a good administrator, a good politician. Okay, and poetry is useless. Okay, so this is what Thomas Love Peacock has written in his essay, The Four Stages. Now it is Shelley's turn. Shelley has replied these charges of Thomas Love Peacock, because Shelley himself was a great lover and devotee of poetry. He cannot tolerate these things, right? He cannot tolerate that anyone can come and say anything about the poets and poetry. So Shelley tries to re-establish the nobility and dignity of poetry by writing his famous essay, Defense of Poetry. Here he has presented several points. One by one we are going to discuss them. Number one, he said that poetry is better than nature. God created this world, but according to Shelley, the world created by the poet is even greater than the world created by God. Nature's world is created by God, but poetic world is created by the poet, and that poetic world is greater than natural world. Okay, he says that writing poetry is the highest of all human powers because it is more creative than any other art. Okay, writing poetry is a creative art, and all arts and sciences depend upon nature, but the poet goes beyond this nature and creates a better nature in his world of poetry. And the same kind of idea had been expressed by Sir Philip Sidney during the 16th century. Sidney also wrote one critical essay, An Apology for Poetry. There he has written this line, as you can see on the screen: nature's world is brazen, the poets deliver only golden. Sidney also believed that this world, nature's world, God's world, is made of brass, and the poet's world is made of gold, right? So Sidney goes in the line, Shelley, P.B. Shelley goes in the line of Sidney and says the same thing. Shelley believes that writing poetry alone is the best kind of profession that you can have in your life. And he says that poetry is the record of the best and the happiest moments. The best moments in the life of the poet are recorded by the poet in his poetry. Okay, poetry makes immortal all that best and most beautiful were in the world. All things which are most beautiful things, the happiest things in the world, they all are gathered in poetry. So poetry is the most beautiful art according to Shelley. Another important thing he mentions is the importance of morality in poetry. Shelley considers poetry as a very useful art, a utilitarian art. According to him, poetry awakens our mind enlarges our human understanding. It removes ignorance and it gives us the light of knowledge, right? So poetry is not a useless activity. He says that, if I use his own words, as you can see on the screen, he says that poetry is an art which brings civilization in the society, which makes the people civilized people, mannered people, cultured people. He says that poetry brings this civilization by awakening and by enlarging the mind itself, by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil. Veil means parda. It removes the veil from the hidden beauty of the world. Whatever beauty is found in this world, which is hidden in this world, the veil, the parda, has been removed by the poet, and these most beautiful divine thoughts are presented in the poetry, and that poetry awakens and enlightens our mind, human mind. So that brings civilization, according to Shelley, right? In Sanskrit literature also it is said that sa vidyaya vimuktaye. This is the knowledge which makes us free from ignorance. So Shelley goes in the same line of thought. Shelley has made a survey of the whole history of poetry, down the ages. He examined even the ancient period, the classical period. He examined the poetry written by Homer and Virgil. He examined the Christian period. He also examined the Middle Ages, and he examines the poetry written during his own times. And later on, he finds that all poetry written, whether in ancient times, Middle Ages, or in the present times, all poetry is indeed divine poetry. He believes that poets play a very important role, a very significant role in molding the civilization, and he says that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Poets are the greatest judges of the world. Okay, so he respects poets and poetry. Third important argument is about his views on rhyme and meter. Shelley defines poetry as the presentation of the power of imagination, right? What is poetry, if you ask him? Shelley replies, poetry is the expression of imagination, and he denies the necessity of rhyme and meter. He says that rhyme and meter are not so much important in poetry. Important element in poetry is only the nobility of thoughts, high serious thoughts, noble ideas, and noble language. These two are the most important requirements of writing divine poetry. He says that it is not rhyming and versing that maketh poesy. Okay, he says rhyming and versing does not make poetry. One may be a poet without versifying and a versifier without poetry. So to be a versifier is a different thing, to be a poet is a different thing. Shelley says that rhythm, is important in poetry, but that rhythm does not come from versification or meter. True rhythm actually comes from the nobility of thought, from great thoughts, from noble thoughts. The rhythm naturally enters in the language, and that natural rhythm of language makes your poetry true poetry, divine poetry. So there is no essential difference between the prose writer and the poet, according to Shelley, because he rejects the use of meter and rhyme. Okay, so Shelley considers Plato even Bacon as the poets in this regard. Bacon was an essayist. He has written prose essays, but Shelley finds rhythm in his thoughts and he calls him a poet. Okay, so these are the three important points about nature. Let me show you once again. Morality in poetry. Okay, he also argued that poetry is better than nature. Then he gives more importance to morality and poetry, and then he rejects rhyme and meter. He gives importance to rhythm, but that rhythm comes from language and the noble thoughts. So now let's conclude by saying that Shelley has written this essay, Defense of Poetry. It is a reply to Peacock's charges against the poets and poetry, and it shows how much respect Shelley had for his own profession as a poet. Poetry, according to him, shapes human mind, shapes, molds human civilization, and poetry leads us to morality, to a moral world. He places the poets on the highest platform and says that they are the legislators of the world. Many other critics who lived after Shelley, they have appreciated Shelley as a poet. One of them is William Butler Yeats, who lived during the 20th century. He says he calls this essay, Defense of Poetry, as the profoundest essay on the foundation of poetry in English. Wilson Knight, another thinker and critic, he also calls this essay as the most important original prose document in our English language. So various critics have eulogized, have appreciated Shelley as a critic and his contribution to English criticism. So here we come to the end of this discussion. If you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel, and please do share this video among your friends and classmates. Thank you very much.